Hello friends, Erie here with another video. This week is going to be a review of The Witch's Altar, which is a book I've really enjoyed. This is my second time or my third time reading it. So if you've been liking my content, you could do me a huge favor and like, subscribe, comment, interact with this. I would really appreciate it. With that said, we're going to get right in. Starting with the introduction, they make it very clear who is speaking in which part. Underneath each header, they tell you who is speaking. And I found that a nice touch, because a lot of times when a book is authored by more than one person, it all just bleeds together and they don't have separate voices. So that makes this a little more unique, a little more personable to me. The entire time, the authors are essentially just talking to you as if you're sitting across the kitchen table from them, and they're sharing what they've learned. They're sharing their experiences, which is a huge plus for me. In chapter 1, there is a discussion of what is an altar. Mostly dictionary-style definition with a little bit of comparison to other religions or other paths. Specifically, they talk about how shrines, sanctuaries, tabernacles, temples, reliquaries, ofrendas, stupa, grotto, groves, circles, all of these things are sacred spaces, and all of these things can, in many ways, be used interchangeably as an altar. This chapter actually had a lot more quotes in it that were relevant to me. So one of the first ones, which is essentially the premise of the book. Who gets to define how we connect or commune with the divine aspects of our world? The short answer is you do. What exactly constitutes worship or ritual to you will determine what is or isn't an altar or a shrine. It shouldn't matter if you see yourself as a priest, priestess, or not, or if you hold X number of degrees, or are just starting to figure things out. This is very much a reference book. And it is approachable more as a beginner book than a intermediate or advanced. Most of my thoughts about this as a resource is that it name drops so many different traditions, so many different people, so many different religions, and how they all interact with sacred space. Because of that, it's very shallow on each of these topics, but it's a fantastic place to find things to research more. Another quote that I really liked is about your history and how it can inform your sacred space. Specifically, practices we culturally inherit or grow up with can have a lot to do with how we view altars, worship, ritual, and other practices. I think it's important to consider how these things can influence our own paths. I have found this true for myself. So, moment of personal gnosis. Up there, it's kind of small, but I have a whole bunch of Greek gods up there next to a figure from... I was about to say fairy tale because that's what I've been watching, but that would be from One Piece. That's Zoro up there. Then there's a whole bunch of dragons, a whole bunch of unicorns. Over here, I've got some Egyptian gods and my working altar. I have a statue of Thor that unfortunately is missing an arm. He needs a little tender love and care. So throughout my house, I have a lot of different, you could say contradictory, sources of inspiration and connections to divine. I also have a large number of Christian art, specifically different depictions of Christ's life. Because of where I came from, to me, all of these things fit harmoniously. They inform one another. They don't detract from one another. So I love that they included a very similar personal gnosis as my own, that we didn't get where we are without having traveled a path. We had to walk somewhere to get where we are. It's okay to mix and mingle, and I love that they start the book with the do it in the way that works for you. Like I said, very beginner friendly. So with that, we're going to move on to chapter 2, which is The Altar in History and Other Traditions. This chapter is written by Jason. The previous one was written by Tempest. Don't really have any quotes in this chapter because this is essentially just historical information. Name drops a lot of different traditions, a lot of different places, but doesn't really go in depth into anything. As I said previously, excellent resource for finding new things to research, not necessarily really diving into the meat and potatoes of a topic. Oh, and the illustrations are fantastic throughout this book. I put that note here because they have different depictions of various altars and items throughout. Let's find another one. So here's another one. So just beautifully simple, hand-drawn illustrations throughout to describe different elements of altars, sacred spaces, the items on them, all that kind of stuff. Moving into chapter 3. Chapter 3 is all about the pentacle. Specifically as described in ceremonial magic or in more formal ways, where it's not just the 5-pointed star, it's specifically the disc with the 5-pointed star on it, or some other sacred geometry that is used in worship upon an altar or in spell work upon an altar. Gave us a whole bunch of historical information, suggestions on crafting your own, some rites and rituals, using a pentacle. That's one of the other things that's nice about this book. In appropriate places throughout the book, there are examples of here's how you can do something. Not that you have to, but it provides examples so you can see how someone else did it and then modify for yourself. I have one quote out of this section, which is as follows. I often think of the pentacle as my altar's umbilical cord, as it's what connects my ritual space to powers much greater and higher than myself. I like this concept. I like this thought process. We, in the grand scheme of things, are rather small. Not necessarily spiritually or in permanence, just there's so much out there. And I find great comfort in being able to reach up for that support from higher power, for that support from deity. And having extra tools on how to do that is always nice. Chapter 4 is on building an altar, which asks a lot of questions along the lines of what is your purpose? What is your intention behind this altar? Why are you building it? Because that will inform how to build it. Not much to say about this other than it's very down to earth, very practical advice. Chapter 5 is about seasonal altars, which, let's see, I have one quote in here. This one I believe is from Jason. Let me just double check. Yeah, this one's from Jason. And he says, witchcraft does not require anyone to forsake or disown their past beliefs. So if it was something sacred to you as a child, especially around holiday time, there's nothing wrong with putting it on your altar. My grandparents gave me a miniature nativity when I was in college, and it goes up next to all of our Yule stuff every year. Altars should hold the things and sometimes memories we hold dear. I find anything that links me to family sacred. I have found the same in my life. And it's funny that he talks about the nativity. I have several nativities from my mother. Some of which I had bought for her and then came back to me after she passed. I can't imagine a Yule altar without those memories of her, and without the memories of helping decorate with her. She was born and raised Catholic, and then got baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And then I was raised Latter-day Saint. And I can't talk about faith or about my path, my journey, or how I got here without it informed so much of my upbringing. I am a Christian practitioner. I can't divorce those two because they're both an intrinsic part of me. And my sacred space, as also explained in the book, should represent that. They also give examples in this chapter of how to dedicate an altar, both as a solo practitioner and in a group, and included some recipes for altar cakes and mooncake. So chapter 6. And I'm skipping over some of these quotes because I'm getting kind of long on the video. 6 is about devotional altars. And this chapter is by Jason again. And he says, many of the most important altars in my house are devotional altars dedicated to specific gods. The word devotion can be used in a multitude of ways, and every witch's feelings about devotion to deity are going to be different. To some, devotion implies a sort of servitude towards the gods, but it's never been that in my experience. The Oxford Dictionary's primary definition to devotion is love, loyalty, or enthusiasm for a person or activity, which sums up my relationship to the gods and goddesses in my life quite accurately. Sums up my experiences too. I guess that's part of why I like this book so much, is maybe it's confirmation bias. But reading about their backgrounds and where they came from and how they ended up where they are, I'm seeing so many parallels to my own life, and it's comforting to me. So this is kind of a comfort book in addition to just a general resource. There's some information about food offerings, and they brought up the idea of actually just putting a part of your meal when you are eating on the altar, and then when you clean up their portion of the meal as well. Poems as offerings, and essentially a lot of different ideas of possible ways you can interact with a specific altar in your space that's dedicated to a specific deity or being. Chapter 7 is outdoor altars, which is nothing particularly earth-shattering. Down-to-earth concerns like weather, wildlife, people, privacy, upkeep, that kind of stuff. And the part that I really liked was there is a specific section of suggestions for renters. Of, you don't own the property, there's only so much you can modify. How can you modify things in a way that is not going to be a problem when you move? There is one quote out of here that I do want to read, though, on page 211. Just because I've heard this so often, and I agree. This was by Tempest. It frustrates me when people say, oh, I could never afford to do that. Isn't a huge part of witchcraft focusing your will and intent? By saying you can't do a thing, you're not going to get much further because you're defeating yourself. I have found this to be true in far more than just creating sacred space. So I liked that. There's also some basic etiquette about visiting other people's sacred spaces, about public shrines, temples, that kind of stuff, and a section on fae and kinfolk. That section is incredibly basic, but it's not the main topic of this text. The authors even say it themselves. There is a lot of information out there for it, but that's not the purpose of this book. Chapter 8 is Altars for the Dead. And I got one that I want to focus on here because this is how I view interactions with the dead as well. The question is, but what if you have no blood ancestors to visit? No dear ones? You do. We, all of us, are part of the human family. Chances are that you have some sort of connection to someone in just about any cemetery. I have found this to be true. I'm fairly certain it's called like the 7 degrees of separation. If you look, you will find connections with people. A lot of the cemeteries around here, even though my family transplanted to this area, I've found lots of connections because of the people who previously lived here and then moved away, and then particularly with such a transient population like the United States, I bet I would find third or fourth cousins in pretty much any cemetery in the United States if I actually started looking. Because I come from a long line of large Mormon and large Catholic families. I mean, go back 2 generations, 13 kids. My grandmother on my dad's side was one of 13 children who survived to adulthood. There were more, but 13 who survived to adulthood. That's a lot. And they're kind of scattered. So there is a connection, even if it's not your actual blood, your actual direct line ancestry. If they went back to a similar location back when the population of the world was smaller, you will find connections to them. This chapter also includes some instructions about how to do a grave dirt memory spell, how to summon spirits with your altar pentacle, which was brought up earlier in the book, some sample rituals, and there was a quote inside one of the alternatives. So this one was one of the guest writers inside the book, Lisa Wagoneer. And she talked about how she knew a lot about one side of her family, but almost nothing about the other. But when she started looking and found even just a little bit, she could feel the anguish of not knowing, of the ancestors who wished to have a closer relationship to her because she is their daughter, their granddaughter, etc., etc. The way she described it is, I added them to my ancestor altar, along with a few items that reminded me of them. I felt the knot of my family anguish untying as I gazed upon my wonderfully eclectic and dynamic family. I love this. I love that they included so many different voices in this book. Chapter 9 is Altars on the Go. Again, not much to say about that. And 10, Troubleshooting on an Altar, is a question and answer style chapter of advice, ranging from how to keep cats off the altar to disposing of broken items and cleaning up wax and wine stains. The bibliography has about 17 additional books of what they sourced as their source of quotes, etc. And they included a couple of websites that they personally like for purchasing statuary and altar wares. So, now that I've done probably far too thorough of a summary of the book, how do I think this book rates? I've decided when I am doing book reviews, I want to talk about 3 primary metrics of how I'm going to rate a book. First, clarity of writing. Is it understandable? Because I am so sick and tired of smarter than you type books. I'm very tired of reading books that come across more as a scientific research paper than having a conversation with someone and actually having usable information in it. 2, pleasure of reading. Was it an enjoyable experience? And I know that is a ridiculously nuanced / opinionated way of judging a book, but it's my book review. So, and 3rd, accuracy. Did they cite sources? Did they identify whether something was personal belief or if it was documented? So with those 3 things, those 3 metrics, how does this book rate? For clarity of writing, very accessible language. Like I said, it's essentially sitting down, having these 2 people, having Jason and Tempest at your table, or Laura. Well, she goes by Tempest everywhere else in the book, so Tempest, at your dinner table, having a friendly chat. For the pleasure of reading, the first time I read this, I read it in a day and a half. This time, I was a little more thorough. I've been a bit slower. I wrote down the quotes that were important to me. I actually studied it this time instead of just devouring it. And for accuracy, did they cite sources? Not particularly. While they do have a handful of direct quotes, the bibliography it's not cited throughout the book. But they did clearly do research. Otherwise, they wouldn't have their bibliography with the books that they used as sources. So, overall, I recommend this book as a resource for, 1, learning the history of sacred space, because it does a fantastic job giving an overview of the history of sacred space. And a lot of the words that can be used interchangeably for sacred space based on the tradition that you come from, or that you are interacting with, or the friends that you're talking to. Additionally, like I said earlier, it was just so refreshing to be able to read about people being very open and clear with, I wasn't always a practitioner. I started in this group and I've made my way to that group. I know that conversation topic has become a lot more common in recent years, but I remember when I started learning things, I was told repeatedly, oh no, don't tell people that you were Christian. People will hate you for that. I haven't seen that very much anymore. There are definitely still people who are really caught in the trauma of the ancestral trauma. And that's just where they are. But in my experience, a lot more people have looked at it and gone, I'm glad that you are able to see the value of different paths. I'm grateful that you... for example, when I first started learning about the various folk healing practices, the various witchcraft, the various... all of it, one of my friends of that time period would routinely tell me, you're the only nice Mormon I know. Because I didn't try to proselytize every time I talked to her. But that wasn't the purpose of having a friend. It was to have a friend, not to proselytize. So, again, going off topic. Apparently I'm good for that today. long story short, I highly recommend the book. Not an ad, not a paid sponsorship. I bought this myself. Actually, this is my second copy because somewhere along the line I lost my first one. Yeah. Until next time, walk in the light, my friends. Bye.